During parent-teacher night, my daughter introduced her stepdad as my real dad and me as my mom's ex. I shook the teacher's hand and left quietly. That week, her braces payment bounced and her summer camp got canceled. Now my ex showed up crying. I, 42M, never thought 12 words could destroy everything I'd built over the past decade. But there I was, standing in my daughter's classroom during parent-teacher night, listening to her introduce the man who'd been in her life for barely 18 months as her real dad, while I became just her mom's ex. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly at what she assumed was a blended family success story. My daughter stood between her mother and her stepdad, beaming with pride as she gestured toward him. She told the teacher how wonderful her real dad was, how he helped with homework every night, how he was taking her camping this summer. Then she glanced at me with those eyes that used to light up when I walked through the door and casually mentioned that I was just Mom's ex-husband. The words hit like a physical blow. 10 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, dance recitals, and soccer games reduced to 4 words. Mom's ex-husband. Not dad. Not even my name. Just an inconvenient remnant of her mother's past. I watched my ex-wife shift uncomfortably, her face reddening as she avoided eye contact. The stepdad stood there with a smug satisfaction that made my stomach turn. He'd been working on this moment, I realized. All those little comments about being the man of the house now. All those times he'd corrected my daughter when she called me dad in front of him. This was his victory lap. Mrs. Henderson looked confused, glancing between us as she tried to process the family dynamics. She asked if we were all here together for the conference, and my daughter quickly explained that her real dad and mom were here for the important stuff, while I was just there because I had to be. I shook Mrs. Henderson's hand, told her it was nice meeting her, and walked out of that classroom with whatever dignity I had left. The hallway felt endless as I heard my daughter's voice behind me, continuing to gush about her wonderful stepdad to anyone who would listen. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the pictures covering my refrigerator. Every birthday, every Christmas morning, every proud moment captured and displayed like trophies of a life that apparently meant nothing. My daughter's gap-toothed grin smiled back at me from a dozen different angles, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. The divorce had been brutal, but I'd fought for joint custody and won. I'd been paying child support religiously, covering health insurance, dental work, school supplies, extracurricular activities, and summer camps. I'd bent over backward to maintain stability for my daughter, even when her mother made it clear she wanted me out of the picture entirely. But sitting there in the dark, I realized I'd been playing a game where the rules kept changing. Every sacrifice, every extra dollar, every weekend rearranged to accommodate their schedule had been taken for granted. Worse, it had been weaponized against me. My reliability had become evidence that I was just a bank account with legs. The next morning, I called my lawyer. The conversation was brief but enlightening. He explained that while I was legally obligated to pay child support, all the extras, the orthodontics, the summer camps, the private school tuition supplements, were voluntary. My daughter had made it clear where her loyalties lay. Maybe it was time her real dad stepped up to handle the real responsibilities. I spent the weekend going through my finances, calculating exactly how much I'd been spending beyond the court-ordered support. The number was staggering. Between the braces, the camps, the tutoring, the dance lessons, and the endless parade of things she needed, I'd been paying nearly double what the court required. Monday morning, I made the calls. First to the orthodontist's office, where I explained that I would no longer be responsible for the account. They were welcome to pursue payment from the custodial parent and her spouse. The receptionist sounded confused, asking about the automatic payment that was due to process that week. I told her to cancel it. Next was the summer camp. The same camp my daughter had been attending for 3 years, the same camp where she'd made lifelong friends and learned to kayak and rock climb. I explained that I would not be covering this year's fees. They could contact her mother about payment arrangements. The dance studio, the tutoring center, the music lessons. One by one, I systematically withdrew my financial support from everything beyond the basic court-ordered requirements. Each call felt like cutting a tether that had been binding me to a relationship that no longer existed. My phone started ringing Wednesday afternoon. The orthodontist's office called first, explaining that the payment had been declined and they needed to reschedule the next appointment until the account was current. Then the camp director, apologizing but explaining that without payment, they'd have to release my daughter's spot to another child. I let them all go to voicemail. Thursday, my ex-wife called. Her voice was tight with barely contained panic as she asked what was happening with all these bills. I told her exactly what I'd told my daughter's teacher, that I was just mom's ex-husband, and it seemed inappropriate for me to continue handling responsibilities that belonged to her real family. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all its usual venom. She asked if I was serious, if I really intended to leave my daughter hanging like this. I reminded her that according to our daughter, I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was simply stepping back so her real dad could take over these responsibilities. Friday brought a flurry of increasingly desperate calls. My ex-wife had apparently reached out to her new husband about covering the expenses I'd withdrawn from. The conversation hadn't gone well. Suddenly, the man who'd been so eager to play house wasn't quite as enthusiastic about the financial realities of being a real dad. The orthodontist had rescheduled my daughter's appointment twice, waiting for payment that wasn't coming. The summer camp had called to inform them that the spot had been given to another child from the waiting list. The dance studio had suspended lessons until the account was current. I found myself wondering what my daughter was thinking as her carefully constructed new reality began crumbling around her. Was she starting to understand the difference between a fun stepdad who played games and bought ice cream, and an actual father who handled the boring, expensive responsibilities that kept her life running smoothly? Update 1. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday at a coffee shop, reading and enjoying the peace of not having to shuttle between activities and appointments. For the first time in months, I wasn't checking my phone every few minutes for schedule changes or last-minute requests. Sunday evening, my ex-wife showed up at my door. I almost didn't recognize her. The perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her makeup was smudged like she'd been crying, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her in despite every instinct telling me to keep the door closed. She sat on my couch, the same couch she'd complained about during our marriage, calling it ugly and uncomfortable, and broke down completely. Through her tears, she told me everything. How her new husband had exploded when she asked him to cover the expenses, calling my daughter his stepdaughter, not his responsibility. How he'd accused her of trapping him in a relationship with financial obligations he never agreed to. How he'd suggested maybe it was time for my daughter to learn that actions have consequences. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd been so proud to be called dad in public had shown his true colors the moment real responsibility knocked on his door. My daughter was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between words and commitment. My ex-wife begged me to reconsider. She admitted she'd made mistakes, that she should have corrected our daughter's introduction at the school. She promised it would never happen again, swore that she'd make sure my role was respected and acknowledged. I listened to her promises, the same promises I'd heard during our divorce mediation, the same promises that had been broken repeatedly over the past 2 years. I told her that I'd been clear about my expectations. My daughter had made her choice about who her real father was, and I was simply respecting that decision. She asked what it would take to fix this, and I told her the truth, that this wasn't about money or pride. It was about respect. For 2 years, I'd watched my role as a father be systematically diminished while I continued to provide financially. I'd been reduced to a walking ATM, while another man received the credit for my sacrifices. The conversation lasted hours. She alternated between anger and desperation, sometimes blaming me for being petty, sometimes pleading with me to think about what this was doing to our daughter. I remained calm, pointing out that I was simply following the family structure that had been established. If her husband was the real dad, then he could handle the real responsibilities. Update 2. Monday brought a call from my daughter herself. Her voice was small and confused as she asked why her braces appointment had been canceled, why she couldn't go to camp this summer. I told her she should ask her real dad about those things, since he was the one responsible for her now. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. She asked if I was mad at her, if I didn't love her anymore. My heart shattered, but I kept my voice steady as I explained that I would always love her, but she'd made it clear that I wasn't her real father. Real fathers handle things like braces and summer camp. She started crying then, saying she was sorry, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I asked her what exactly she was sorry for for hurting me, or for the consequences of her choices. She couldn't answer. That evening, my ex-wife called again. Her tone had shifted from desperate to angry. She accused me of using my daughter as a weapon, of punishing a child for something that wasn't her fault. I reminded her that our daughter was 13, old enough to understand the weight of her words and choices. She demanded to know what kind of man uses a child's mistake to justify abandoning his responsibilities. I asked her what kind of mother allows her child to publicly disrespect the father who's been supporting her, and what kind of stepfather encourages that behavior. The argument escalated until she was screaming about taking me back to court, threatening to fight for increased child support to cover all the expenses I dropped. I calmly reminded her that I was already paying above the court-ordered amount in basic support, and that any additional expenses would need to be justified to a judge who would want to know why her new husband couldn't contribute. That threat seemed to deflate her. We both knew her husband's true colors had been revealed, and no court would look favorably on a stepfather who refused to support a child he claimed to love. Update 3. Tuesday afternoon, I got an unexpected call from Mrs. Henderson, my daughter's teacher. She apologized for bothering me at work, but said she felt compelled to reach out after witnessing what had happened at parent-teacher night. She told me that in her 20 years of teaching, she'd seen many blended families navigate complex dynamics, but she'd been troubled by the situation in my daughter's classroom. She'd observed my daughter's behavior change over the past year, noting increased anxiety and what seemed like coached responses when discussing family matters. Mrs. Henderson had done some research after our meeting and discovered that I was the parent who'd been handling all school communications, emergency contacts, and financial responsibilities. She wanted me to know that my dedication hadn't gone unnoticed and that she was concerned about the emotional manipulation my daughter seemed to be experiencing. Her call was a wake-up moment. I'd been so focused on the financial aspect of the situation that I'd missed the bigger picture. My daughter wasn't just being disrespectful. She was being manipulated by adults who should have been protecting her emotional well-being. That evening, I made a decision. I called the orthodontist and arranged to pay the outstanding balance, but with specific conditions. All future communications would go through me directly, and any attempts to transfer financial responsibility would need to be documented and approved by both parents. I did the same with the summer camp, securing my daughter's spot, but making it clear that I was the point of contact for all matters related to her attendance. The message was clear. I was still her father, and I would continue to act in her best interests, but the games were over. When my ex-wife called that night to thank me, I cut her off before she could finish her sentence. I explained that this wasn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. This was about my daughter's well-being, and my actions moving forward would be guided by that principle alone. I told her that from now on, all communications would be documented and focused solely on our child's needs. The days of casual requests and last-minute demands were over. If her husband wanted to play the role of father, he could contribute financially and emotionally, or he could step back and acknowledge his true position in the family dynamic. Final update. 3 weeks later, my daughter showed up at my apartment for our scheduled weekend visit. She was quieter than usual, and I could see she'd been crying. We sat on my supposedly ugly couch, and she finally opened up about everything that had been happening at home. She told me about the fights between her mother and stepfather, how he'd started treating her differently once the financial pressures mounted. She described feeling caught between two households, trying to please everyone and succeeding with no one. With tears streaming down her face, she apologized for what she'd said at the school. She explained that her stepfather had been coaching her about how to handle questions about family, convincing her that it would make her mother happy if she presented their home as the real family. I held my daughter as she sobbed, feeling the weight of the past month's events. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about teaching her that words have consequences, that relationships require respect and honesty, and that love isn't just about fun moments, but about showing up when things get difficult. I told her that I forgave her, but that we needed to establish new ground rules for our relationship. I would continue to support her in every way a father should, but I expected honesty and respect in return. No more games, no more manipulation, no more taking my presence in her life for granted. She promised to do better, and for the first time in months, I believed her. We spent the weekend talking about everything: her fears about the divorce, her confusion about family roles, her anxiety about disappointing everyone. It was the most honest conversation we'd had since the separation. Monday morning, I received a text from my ex-wife. Her husband had moved out over the weekend, unable to handle the reality of supporting a family. She was facing the prospect of single parenthood with a 13-year-old who now understood the difference between performative love and genuine commitment. I felt no satisfaction in her situation. If anything, I felt sad that it had taken such dramatic circumstances for everyone to understand what should have been obvious from the beginning. Being a parent isn't about titles or recognition. It's about showing up consistently and without condition, even when it's hard. As I write this, my daughter is sleeping in her room at my apartment. Her braces are back on track, she's excited about summer camp, and most importantly, she calls me Dad again. Not because I demanded it, but because she understands what it means. The road ahead won't be easy. There will be more challenges, more moments where my commitment is tested, and more opportunities for the adults in my daughter's life to fail her. But I've learned something valuable through this experience. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices, even when it breaks your heart to watch. My daughter learned that words matter, that relationships require mutual respect, and that real love sometimes looks different from what we expect. I learned that being a father means more than just providing financially. It means being willing to make hard decisions that serve your child's long-term well-being, even when it hurts in the moment. The teacher who witnessed that parent-teacher night disaster probably has no idea how much her simple observation changed our lives. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see clearly what's been happening right in front of us. I'm still my daughter's father, and I always will be. But now she knows what that really means, and more importantly, she knows what it costs to take that for granted. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have to deliver them.